Evolutionary Epistemology Lab. Evolution for a long time has been associated with the field of biology and the evolution of life. But today we define evolution much broader. We include it into the sociocultural sciences. And I very much defend the idea that there is not really a distinction to be made on the one hand between history and on the other hand evolution. Or so if you look at language variation or cultural variation or the history of languages or the history of cultures, I think we can talk about that in evolutionary terms as well. One of the consequences of accepting evolution is that if there is such a phenomenon as evolution out there, the major consequence of that is that there cannot be anything in this universe that has not evolved. So whether you are looking at an organism or a species or a behavior portrayed by that organism, such as language or culture, we can basically say that all of this is the result and the outgrowth of evolution, the outcome of evolution, and so therefore I believe that evolutionary theory can be applied to explain all these different phenomena. The idea that the modern synthesis is incomplete has basically co-evolved with the foundation of the modern synthesis. So Pavilion, for example, has written a very famous article about extending the modern synthesis. And he, for example, especially makes the case on how evo-devo and phenotypic plasticity and niche construction require us to extend the modern synthesis, and that is very true. On the other hand, the plea for an extension of the synthesis or the recognition that the modern synthesis was incomplete goes much further in time. Ideas on symbiosis, symbiogenesis were already described by people such as Merezkovsky and Polyansky in the early 1900s, and these people were never part of a modern synthesis. Macroevolution, as it has developed as a field within paleontology, and the theory of punctuated equilibria as it was developed by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, was already a theory that pointed out that the modern synthesis, that microevolution, the emphasis on microevolution and on genetic evolution, is not sufficient to explain the big picture of how evolution occurs, and there might be levels and factors not included in the study of so if you look at species or organisms or populations, they might evolve by means that are not reducible to a genetic level. So if you find yourself in a very harsh environment, climate change, geographical barriers, things like that, they might contribute to how you will evolve as a species. Species extinction, for example, might be explained by random events such as the impact of a meteor and the devastating impacts that has on the environment. Defining an extended synthesis is difficult at the moment. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of people are defining evolutionary theory differently. So the modern synthesis basically combined natural selection theory with Mendelian heredity laws and the population genetics points of view. For many years it has defined how evolution by means of natural selection is to proceed. Now today, people are looking into how natural selection can be applied in other fields. You have the rise of sociobiology. You have, so basically the study of sociocultural behavior, what are the biological roots of that sociocultural behavior, and how can we study sociocultural behavior from within a selectionist point of view. Today people are talking about directed selection, stabilizing selection. Is natural selection a theory that only weeds out maladaptive organisms, or is natural selection a theory that also positively selects for the most adapted form. These are questions that today are being raised, and one can already ask oneself whether or not that part belongs to an extension of the modern synthesis when we say that natural selection not only weeds out maladaptive organisms, but that perhaps it designs, as Dawkins says, adaptive organisms, or if there is such a thing as accumulative selection. We can ask ourselves whether or not that is part of the framework that was provided by the modern synthesis by people such as Dobzhansky and Meyer, who made a very clear distinction between, on the one hand, variation and on the other hand, selection of that variation. So in that regard, the way that we understand natural selection theory today is already different from the way that people that were founding the modern synthesis described it. On the other hand, we have the rise of ecology, which is an event that took place after the foundation of the modern synthesis. We have the rise of ecology, of macroevolutionary theory, punctuated equilibria, evo-devo, evo-devo-eco, the relation between evolution, development, and ecology. Studies on symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, genetic drift. All of these are now phenomena that are studied via evolution. These phenomena are now more and more studied, and people, on the one hand, plead for an extension of the modern synthesis in that regard, and nobody is denying that natural selection is not a valid theory. On the other hand, when people say that we need to extend the modern synthesis, basically we are arguing for the fact that we also need to take into account these new theories that have been developing, ecology, evo-devo, symbiosis, symbiogenesis, evolution, etc. In a way, I think if you just look at the development of science, it's a natural consequence. Of course, science evolves itself, and scientists have been very successful. We've had the discovery of the structure of genetic material, the rise of the field of molecular biology and molecular genetics, which happened after the foundation of the modern synthesis. So in a way, I think it is very normal that we have reached a point that we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, so how do all these different findings allow for painting a broader picture of evolution? So in that regard, I think it's very normal that people are pleading for an extension of the modern synthesis. What we see today, on the other hand, is that people are not only pleading for an extension of the modern synthesis from within a selectionist framework, people from within other evolutionary accounts, such as people that have developed evolutionary theories based on natural gene transfer and evolution, are saying that an extension of the modern synthesis in and of itself is insufficient. A phenomenon that they study, such as lateral gene transfer, symbiosis, symbiogenesis, evolution, are so distinctively different of how evolution by means of natural selection occurs, that they find it necessary to cause for a rupture with the modern synthesis. So nobody is denying that evolution by means of natural selection occurs. Natural selection is a very important evolutionary mechanism. But sometimes these new evolutionary mechanisms, the way that they cause for certain evolutionary phenomena, the way that they underlie certain evolutionary phenomena, are so distinctively different from how we have been conceptualizing evolutionary change, that they say that there might be a rupture and that it's time to develop a whole new biology, to develop a whole new conceptual framework. Now, as a philosopher of science, it is of course very interesting to see how people debate these ideas and what the reasons for that are. And it's quite an exciting time to do research and to investigate evolution, because we are, I really think so, on the brink of a scientific revolution. And so it's very interesting to live through that change right now. How the new biology would be conceptualized at this moment in time, we don't know. But one of the things we see in general, I think we can distinguish between three different tendencies. First of all, we know that evolution has no unilinearity, or we already knew that evolution had no directionality because of natural selection being a blind process. But still, if you look at natural selection theory, there's a very rigid linearity going from genes to proteins to cells. And there cannot be any kind of informed evolution, so you cannot have any processes such as Lamarck. Ontogenetically acquired features cannot feed back into the genome. So one of the things we see now in general is that people are looking into reverse directionality in a way. So people are studying whether there is such a thing as Lamarckian inheritance at the genetic level, at the social cultural level, things like that. If you look at symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, what you see here again is that people are investigating these forms of directionality, and we see that there is multi-directionality possible. It's not necessary to have vertical transmission from one generation to the next. If you look at bacteria, they can very freely donate genes. We also know that lateral gene transfer is not something that is only part of the prokaryotic way of life. We also know that it occurs in multicellular organisms. We know that hybridization plays a very important role in plant evolution. We also have evidence now that it is part of our hominid evolution. There has been recent evidence that there was transfer between Neanderthals and humans, and we don't really know how that transfer occurred. Was that because of hybridization, or was that perhaps because of viral infections between these different species? We don't know, but we know that there was horizontal transfer of genetic material between these species. So in that regard, we see that there is a tendency to understand evolution as a very rigid process, to understanding evolution as something that can have multiple directions and different means of transfer. So we have a tendency to go from vertical transmission to recognizing vertical and horizontal transmission, and then asking ourselves the question, how do these different types of transmission interact? So that I would describe as one change that we are undergoing in this new evolutionary biology. We are looking into multidirectionality. Secondly, I think, I also think that the time is ripe for that. We are going from a general tendency to reduce evolution to one unit, such as the gene or the replicator, we're evolving towards a more holistic point of view of evolution. So for a very long time, people have been debating, is natural selection the major evolutionary mechanism out there? Is drift just a period of no selection? Or is it an evolutionary mechanism in and of itself? When people were first introducing lateral gene transfer and symbiosis, people would say, but of course you have selection at certain moments in time when you have these horizontal transfers. And so people were debating which is the most important evolutionary mechanism. People were also fighting about what the true unit of evolution is. Is it a gene, is it a meme, is it a replicator, is it a cultural gene, things like that. I think another way of thinking about evolution that is emerging today is the recognition of plurality, and as such going from a reductionist point of view to a holistic point of view, because we know that there can be several units of evolution, of biological evolution, of sociocultural evolution. Not all of these units are replicators, not all of these units are passed down horizontally or vertically. So we very much realize now that there is a multiplicity of units, that there is a multiplicity of levels where these units evolve, and that there is also a multiplicity of evolutionary mechanisms. So instead of fighting about what is the most important evolutionary mechanism out there that is going to explain evolution, people are starting to recognize that all these evolutionary mechanisms occur. We also have scientific data providing and proving that this is the case. So I think one of the questions of the future, the question of our generation, is that we have to now start to conceptualize how these different units, levels, and mechanisms together make up this evolutionary phenomena. Also, evolution in itself, by taking it away from the domain of biology, has to be reconceptualized, because studying the evolution of the brain, or studying the evolution of cognition, or studying the evolution of lizards or of elephants can be quite different from one another. So here I think that one of the challenges of the future of our generation will be to conceptualize how these different units, levels, and mechanisms and these kinds of evolution interact. And I see that as a tendency towards a holism, and I also think that because of the rise of bioinformatics and artificial intelligence and just the means in which we can process data, for the first time in history allows us to look at all these different parameters and to see how they together fit into the broader picture. In relation to this tendency towards holism and plurality, I see a third tendency that is associated with this new biology, and that has to do with a general recognition that life is not only about competition. Because there is a plurality of units, of levels, of mechanisms, and of kinds of evolution, we have to study how all of these elements interact. And also with the recognition of ecology, co-evolutionary theory, symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, evolution, we are again witnessing that we are not only investigating aspects such as competition, but that we are also looking into interaction. And so interaction between different organisms, interaction between the organism and the environment, between the organism and that environment, how different units, levels, mechanisms, etc. interact. So I think this is also one of the things that is characterizing this new evolutionary framework that is emerging, that people are developing and debating, and it is a tendency to not only look at competition but also to look at interaction. So I would say that this new evolutionary biology and the challenge of the future of our generation is to investigate these 3 points. So what I have been involved in the most is I have been investigating how we can abstract a universal heuristic from symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, and other types of horizontal evolution. So if you look at cultural evolution, language evolution, sociocultural evolution, we see multidirectionality. We see different traits being passed on from one generation to the other, but also you can acquire ideas from complete strangers. You do not have to have sex with them, you can just freely communicate information. It can be quite instantaneous, like just going to class somewhere or hearing somebody on the news or on TV. Can immediately alter your way of thinking. Reading a work written by a dead person such as Plato or Aristotle can make you think differently or perceive the world differently. So I see a lot of resemblance in these aspects of sociocultural evolution and biological evolution as it occurs by means of symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer. And so what I have been doing for the most part of my career is I have been trying to conceive of a conceptual framework that allows us to universalize symbiosis, to take it away from genes and organismal interactions, to investigate aspects of sociocultural evolution. And I would, in that regard, I would recommend my 2007 paper on universal symbiogenesis that has been published by the journal Symbiosis. I've also written a paper on that in 2012.